A black athlete was accused of sexually assaulting a white girl, but the verdict stunned all. As Jamal stood trial, the courtroom became a battleground of conflicting testimonies and missing evidence. The case captivated everyone, sparking debates and protests on all sides. With the final moments of the trial approaching, the weight of justice hung in the balance. When the verdict was read, it left the entire sat in his office, his fingers pressing lightly against his temples. The courtroom had been restless today, the noise of the world outside growing louder by the hour. News channels dissected every detail of the case. Debates raged on talk shows, and the crowd outside the courthouse, the teenage basketball sensation, stood accused of sexually assaulting Hannah Prescott, a girl from one of the wealthiest families in the country. The evidence was thin, but that didn't seem to matter anymore. People had already chosen sides. Judge Whitmore had always prided himself on fairness, but the walls were closing in. He could feel the weight of unseen hands pushing him toward a decision he wasn't ready to make. A knock came at the door, sharp and deliberate. Senator Walter Langford stepped in without waiting for permission. His crisp navy suit, polished shoes, and piercing gaze left no room for small talk. Whitmore knew this was not a courtesy visit. "It's time to wrap this up," Langford said, settling into the chair across from him. He had seen men like Langford before, silent. Men who never made requests, only demands. "Jamal Rivers needs to go away for a long time," Langford continued, his tone calm but unshakable. "A conviction will set things right. Help maintain order. You do want order, don't you?" Whitmore clenched his jaw. "I rule based on facts, not public pressure." Langford smirked, pulling a small folder from his briefcase and sliding it across the desk. Whitmore hesitated, but curiosity won. He opened the folder and felt his pulse quicken. Inside were bank statements, emails, and transaction records, evidence of financial missteps he thought were buried. Investments gone wrong, debts covered by powerful friends, money that had been moved in ways that wouldn't hold up to scrutiny. "If this comes out, Langford, your career is over. Your reputation destroyed. But it doesn't have to end that way. You convict Rivers, and not only will this disappear, but you'll be sitting on the Supreme Court within a year." The choice is simple. The weight of those words settled on Whitmore's shoulders. He had worked too hard to throw it all away now. A future on the highest court in the land was within reach. He glanced at Langford, but was already reaching for his briefcase. "Make the right call, Judge," the senator said, standing up. "The nation is watching." The door clicked shut, leaving Whitmore alone with his thoughts. He had always believed in justice, but now justice felt like a distant concept, overshadowed by politics and power. He stared at the courtroom outside his window, where reporters and protesters clashed over someone would lose. But only one decision would keep his life intact. Whitmore reached for the intercom. "Schedule a meeting with the prosecution. I need to discuss the case." Meanwhile, Emily Whitmore knew something was wrong. Her father had always carried himself with confidence, but lately there was a tightness in his posture, a shadow in his eyes. She understood the weight of major cases, but this was different. He had barely spoken to her in days, and when he did, his words were carefully chosen, like a man stepping through a minefield. She had been following the trial closely. Jamal Rivers' case wasn't solid, and everyone knew it. No clear witnesses, no forensic proof, just a statement from Hannah Prescott and the influence of her family. Even Emily's professors debated it, pointing out the obvious flaws in the case. Yet, the media was relentless, fueling outrage and demanding conviction. Emily sat at her desk, scrolling an opinion piece dissecting the judge's history, praising Whitmore's strong judicial record while subtly hinting at his future. Supreme Court rumors had already begun to swirl. Her stomach turned. Was her father being pressured? The thought was ridiculous. Charles Whitmore wasn't the kind of man who bent to politics. But then again, he had been different lately. She needed answers. The trial began, and she knew exactly the weight of a restless nation. Reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, their cameras flashing as Jamal Rivers entered the building, flanked by his legal team. Inside, Malcolm Price adjusted his tie and exchanged a quiet word with his client before taking his seat. The prosecution, backed by a panel of confident attorneys, carried an air of certainty that should not have belonged to them,
sat with his
not
shoulders
with a
squared,
case this week, his face unreadable. The judge's bench loomed over him, and when Whitmore took his seat, the room fell into silence. The first blow to the defense came within minutes. A key piece of evidence, security footage that placed Jamal across town at the time of the incident, was no longer part of the record. The court clerk announced that it had been misplaced, but his protest was dismissed. Without that footage, Jamal's alibi was now just his word against Hannah Prescott's. The second strike followed. Witnesses who had previously stepped forward to support Jamal suddenly retracted their statements, some refusing to take the stand altogether. One of them, a former teammate, had been in a car accident just days before, a coincidence too convenient, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench. Her father's expression was unreadable, but she caught the way he avoided her gaze. She wasn't the only one who noticed. Malcolm Price glanced toward Whitmore more than once, suspicion etched into his face. Later that evening, Emily met with Price outside the courthouse. He spoke in low tones, checking over his shoulder as he passed her a folder. "The case is being controlled, and now I'm getting threats to step aside." Emily opened the folder to find altered reports, inconsistencies she couldn't ignore. That same night, she received an unexpected message from Tyler Reese, a journalist known for exposing political scandals. He had obtained a copy of the missing footage. "This will clear Jamal," he said. But Tyler never got the chance. The next morning, he was gone. His apartment was empty, his phone disconnected. Emily's heart pounded as she realized someone was making sure that Tyler Reese sat on Emily's phone. A single line that sent chills through her. "Check locker 312 at Grandview Station. USB inside. Trust no one." She gripped her bag tighter as she pushed through the station crowd, her pulse quickening with each step. If Tyler was right, the evidence on that drive could expose everything. But someone had silenced him before he could release it. The station smelled of old coffee and damp concrete, a place where people rushed past one another without a second glance. Emily spotted the locker at the far end of the platform, its scratched surface blending in with the others. She reached into her pocket for the key Tyler had left in her mailbox, slid it into the lock, and pulled the door open. Inside sat a small black USB drive wrapped in a folded note. Hammered. She stuffed the drive into her coat and turned to leave. But as she stepped onto the street, she noticed a dark SUV idling near the curb. A man in a suit stood nearby, speaking into a phone, his gaze shifting toward her. She kept walking, forcing herself to stay calm, but a glance over her shoulder confirmed it. The SUV pulled away from the curb, side street, matching her pace, weaving between pedestrians, before ducking into a crowded cafe. Her breathing slowed as she took a seat in the back corner, gripping the USB tightly in her palm. Flipping open her laptop, she plugged in the drive. Dozens of files loaded onto the screen, emails, bank statements, phone records. She clicked on the first email. It was between Langford and a forensic analyst, instructing them to alter discussing which witnesses needed to be handled. Her stomach churned. This wasn't just about Jamal. This was bigger, an entire system designed to crush whoever stood in its way. A shadow passed over her table. Emily looked up to see Malcolm Price, Jamal's lawyer, lowering himself into the seat across from her. "I had a feeling you'd find something. These people don't play games." Emily pushed the laptop toward him. "We need to get this out." Price studied the screen before nodding. "I know a journalist who might help, but if Langford finds out you have this." The cafe door opened, and two men stepped inside, scanning the crowd. Emily closed the laptop. "They already know." Price's jaw tightened. They slipped out the back entrance, stepping into an alley just as a car yelped to a halt near the front of the cafe. Emily didn't wait to see who was inside. She ran. Emily, realizing she was out of time, pulled out her phone and sent copies of the incriminating files to trusted journalists, legal experts, and Jamal's defense team. If something happened to her, the truth would still come out. A black van cut across her path. The doors slid open, and masked men grabbed her. Whitmore's phone rang minutes later. A voice on the other end gave him a simple choice: deliver the guilty verdict, or Emily would never be seen again. He sat frozen, the courtroom silent as lawyers and reporters awaited his decision. He had never been more aware of the weight of his robes, yet none of them could see what was really happening. In a dimly lit warehouse miles away, Emily sat bound to a chair, her wrists raw from the rough rope. Langford's men stood around her, their expressions blank. One of them stepped forward. "Tell us where you sent the files." She held his stare. "It's too late. They're already out." The man exhaled, holding up her phone. "You think anyone will believe an email from an unknown sender? Journalists bury stories like this every day. What you did," he leaned in, "it was reckless." Emily swallowed hard but kept her voice steady. "Then why am I still alive?" Before he could answer, a noise outside the warehouse caught their attention. Tires screeched, doors slammed. Around her tent, someone shouted for weapons. The door burst open, flooding the room with light. Agents in tactical gear stormed in, knocking Langford's men to the ground before they had a chance to react. Within seconds, the captors were subdued. One of the officers rushed to Emily, cutting the ropes from her wrists. "Your father sent us," the officer said. He made the call. She grabbed her phone. Emily sprinted outside, barely registering the cool air against her skin. A police vehicle idled nearby. She climbed in, breath coming fast as they sped toward the courthouse. Back in the courtroom, Whitmore stared at the verdict sheet in front of him. The paper blurred as he gripped the sides of the bench. Langford sat in the front row, his expression once on the wooden bench beside him, a reminder, a warning. Whitmore glanced at the doors, willing them to open, hoping for a reason to delay what he had to do. Then, a commotion outside. A woman's voice calling his name. The doors flew open. Emily stumbled into the room, her hair disheveled, her face streaked with dirt. The courtroom gasped. Cameras clicked. Langford's expression shifted. His voice rang clear. "Case dismissed." Langford shot to his feet, but it was too late. Officers moved toward him as the reporters exploded with questions. The trial, the scheme, the corruption, it was all unraveling. Emily locked eyes with her father. For the first time in weeks, they understood each other without a word. Emily's voice cut through the courtroom, raw and the room erupted into chaos. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, protesters outside pushed against the courthouse barriers, and legal teams shouted over each other. The judge's gavel slammed against wood, but the noise refused to die down. Jamal's lawyer, Malcolm Price, stepped forward, his voice firm. "We demand an immediate review." Whitmore's gaze fell on Emily, standing in the aisle, dirt streaked across her face, eyes filled with something he hadn't seen before, unwavering certainty. She pulled the USB drive from her pocket and held it up. The footage they buried, it proves Jamal wasn't there. The defense team rushed to examine the files, inserting the drive into a laptop. The screen displayed grainy but clear security footage. Jamal Rivers at a gas station across town, time-stamped at the exact moment of the alleged attack. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The prosecution scrambled, their case crumbling before them. Langford, sitting in the front row, rose from his seat, his expression cold. Without a word, he turned to leave, but the door swung open before he reached. Their eyes locked on him. "Walter Langford," one of them said, pulling out a warrant. "You're under arrest." Cameras flashed as reporters surged forward, shouting questions. Langford's composure cracked for the first time as officers grabbed his arms. "This isn't over." He barked, but the handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. Weight of every choice, Whitmore's every compromise, pressed down on him. He looked at the evidence on the screen, then at Emily, then at Jamal, who had been silent through it all, his life hanging in the balance. A breath passed between them. Whitmore gripped the bench and steadied himself. He turned to the court. "Jamal Rivers is not guilty." A wave of relief swept over the room. Applause, cheers dropped, cries of the months of pressure lifting in an instant. Emily's chest rose with a breath she had been holding for too long. But then Whitmore turned back to the courtroom, his voice carrying weight beyond this single case. "I was complicit in this. I let fear, ambition, and corruption cloud my judgment. I was part of the system that tried to break an innocent man. I will answer for it. He met Emily's The room froze. Even the agents leading Langford away turned, stunned. Whitmore took a step down from the bench toward the officers. I am guilty of conspiracy. I withheld evidence. I abused my position. One of the officers stepped forward, reaching for the cuffs at his belt. Judge Whitmore, are you saying? I'm saying I must be held accountable. I'm sorry. He looked at Emily, the cuffs locked around his wrists. The gavel that had once been his power now seemed distant as the officers led him away. Emily stood in place, the courtroom buzzing around her, reporters rushing to file their stories. But in this moment, nothing else mattered. Jamal stepped out of the courthouse, drawing deep breaths of air as cameras flashed, deflecting questions from the reporters pushing forward with microphones. Protesters who had chanted his name outside now erupted into cheers. Some in the crowd wept, clutching signs demanding justice, while others hugged strangers, sharing the moment. Emily stood at the top of the steps, watching him take his first steps toward freedom. He turned, meeting her gaze. Stripped of his future. No words were needed. Branded a criminal before ever setting foot in a courtroom. Now, that label had been torn away, but the damage remained. Langford, still in handcuffs, was ushered past them toward a waiting vehicle. His face, usually so composed, had hardened. Reporters bombarded him with questions, but he refused to answer. His empire, built on power and influence, had already begun into his connections, and officials who had once stood by his side were now scrambling to distance themselves. Inside the courthouse, Whitmore sat in a holding cell, awaiting transport. His confession had sent shockwaves through the legal community. Every ruling he had ever made was now under scrutiny, every case he had overseen called into question. His once sterling reputation lay in ruins. The door opened, and Emily stepped inside. She studied him for a moment before speaking. I fought for justice, not revenge. But I won't be visiting again. Whitmore gave a slow nod, accepting the weight of her words. He had spent a lifetime building a legacy, only to destroy it with a single choice. Now, all that remained was the truth. Emily walked out, leaving him to face his destiny.